You are now looking at the first motion picture of a television image that has ever been produced.
The first television experiments were like a science fiction writer's fantasy come true. Replicas of human faces transmitted through air, materializing on a piece of furniture. At the 1939 World's Fair in New York, television was the shining example of the marvels of technology.
Hiya, bud.
Hiya.
Now just act and talk naturally.
Oh, is it going?
It's on.
Hiya, folks. This is Clark Gable Middleton speaking. As you can see if you've got your television set turned on.
And later, concerts in miniature. But in its infancy, television was incapable of covering the most important news story of the century.
Das glaube ich und das weiß ich.
World War II would be the finest hour for another medium, radio. And one radio reporter with his wartime broadcasts would set the standard by which every television and radio reporter would be judged.
Hello, America. This is Ed Murrow speaking from London. It's about the people I'd like to talk. The little people who live in those little houses, who have no uniform.
Edward R. Murrow would convert the radio into the most compelling news machine of the war.
This is London, being bombed again. The sound of gunfire has been rolling down these crooked streets like thunder. Half an hour ago, I could read street signs in the flash of anti-aircraft batteries.
Television news was born in a radio tube.
Marked the point where shrapnel fell.
I don't think there has ever been a journalist like Murrow who's come along. And I suppose that is because he started it. Murrow started the whole concept of radio news evolving into television news. He was our model. He was an idol. And I think that as long as I was a broadcaster, I tried to emulate what I thought he would do. And I think a lot of other people did too.
I began to see what was happening to Berlin. The 4,000-pound high explosives were bursting below like great sunflowers gone mad. The small incendiaries were going down like a fistful of white rice thrown on a piece of black velvet.
Murrow was a wonder. He had a very special talent for painting pictures with words. No one ever did it better. People said of John Ruskin in the last century, you'd rather read John Ruskin's description of Venice than go to Venice itself because he was better. Well, Murrow was better than the war, and he really brought the war home to the American people.
Murrow revolutionized electronic news by hiring people not because they were polished radio performers, but because they were intelligent.
Before Murrow, news on the radio consisted of an announcer with a baritone voice who didn't know what he was talking about, reading a few lines written by an underpaid wire service reporter who didn't know what he was talking about. Well, things got exciting in Europe. Murrow and White instituted the World News Roundup, and they hired reporters who brought an awful lot more to a news report than any other person could do. It was very good. I think what their main achievement was they took the medium radio away from the announcers and gave it to reporters.
The largest Canadian convoy of the war has reached Britain.
In Canada, Lorne Greene, the renowned voice of doom, was a touchstone in the nation's homes.
Another German city has been blasted by the RAF Bomber Command.
I've got about 3 minutes.
Before the war, the CBC had no reporters and no news service. It relied entirely on wire service stories. But with thousands of Canadians risking their lives overseas, the CBC was expected to inspire the nation.
All the news that we were getting was from the American networks. And a lot of the big stations were actually affiliates of CBS and NBC. And the government began to say, well, we'd like to have a Canadian reporting on Canada's war effort.
This is Peter BBC reporting from the Italian front. For the dead of Ortona, the bell of its cathedral, the Cathedral of St. Thomas the Apostle, tolled. For the Canadians who died in taking the town, the bell tolled.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from Paris. Today we saw an execution.
The staticky reports from Matthew Halton, Peter Stursberg, and Marcel Ouimet became a binding force for the country.
History seems to vibrate through the Place de la Concorde. And we all wept as we sang the Marseillaise.
World War II was really the birthplace of CBC News. Matthew Halton would be even brought back during the war to do victory bond rallies to urge people to invest in victory bonds and go on tours across the country a couple of times a year. So they became very much a part of the family in the living room.
Radio news emerged from the war with authority.
Lord, there's a perfect view of the battle. There's lots to see. And there's been a great deal to see almost.
And when television swept across the country in the post-war prosperity, the radio reporters thought it was merely an entertainment box, hardly the place for serious news.
I think we rather snobbishly felt we were superior to pictures and showmanship. We were not vaudevillians, we were reporters.
The makers of Camel cigarettes bring the world's latest news events right into your own living room. Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours.
When Camel Cigarettes advertised on our news program, they earnestly requested that we never show a picture of anybody smoking a cigar. They earnestly requested that during the news program, Swayze sitting at a desk, have a cigarette lit and smoking in an ashtray here beside him.
Glad we could get together. John Cameron Swayze saying good night for Camel Cigarettes.
Once in a while when Swayze was away or sick or on vacation or whatever, I filled in for him. And the only thing they asked me to do that I didn't much care for, but I did it, was at the end of the program on Friday nights, I pick up a carton of Camel cigarettes and say, we are happy to say that I'm sort of ad-libbing here, that we have sent 150,000 cartons of Camel cigarettes to our boys overseas.
Sir Winston Churchill came in here today looking as fine and fit as ever, his face pinker than a...
The producers sought permission from the sponsors to show a picture of Winston Churchill. He did smoke a cigar.
And I saw the man in charge of our program, who was a vice president, I am sure, and it was very friendly. I'd met him before, and it took me about 30 seconds to make my case, and he said, sure. And so I said, thank you. And I got up to leave. It was down on 42nd Street, and I had to get way uptown again. As I got to the door, and I said, how about Groucho Marx? And he said, no.
It finally became apparent to the powers that be in network news that if you were advertised by a cigarette, for instance, how in the world could you possibly do a proper story about the tobacco industry? And the same was true if you were sponsored by Oldsmobile. What are you going to do? Go after General Motors?
For the audience, it was sometimes difficult to know what was a commercial and what was a news story.
It's the new thrill, that Futuramic Oldsmobile with the new rocket engine.
Now to New York's famous Hotel Waldorf Astoria for important news about Plymouth.
In the heart of New York City, the executives of Plymouth are being honored with an award that's without precedent in automobile history.
So, to Mr. John P. Mansfield, President of Plymouth, it is my privilege to present this medallion.
This is CBC News Magazine.
In 1952, Canadians had their own television network, and the CBC broadcast the first Made in Canada news program.
Good evening. This is Lorne Green. This week, our cameramen all over the world went to get the news where and when it was happening. Our first story, the story of a manhunt. 4 men escaped from the Toronto jail.
The show looked like an edition of Police Gazette. The radio newsroom was not impressed.
And the unofficial word was, shoot to kill.
The radio newsroom had their own novel approach to television.
There was thought that you could just put a slide up saying the news, and then have a voiceover of an announcer reading at 11 o'clock for television, reading the 10 o'clock radio news, so that you'd get the 10 o'clock radio news at 11 o'clock on television over a slide that said the news.
This is Ed Morrow in New York. Just stand by.
In the United States, one man dramatically alters the course of television news. When Edward R. Murrow brought his radio reporters to television, it would be the defining moment in the history of broadcast journalism.
News analyst Edward R. Murrow in See It Now.
This is an old team trying to learn a new trade.
We are, as newcomers to this medium, rather impressed by the whole thing. Impressed, for example, that I can turn to Don Hewitt here and say, Don, will you push a button and bring in the Atlantic coast?
There she is.
Brooklyn Bridge. Thank you very much. Hold it, please, will you?
See It Now was the first really prestigious broadcasting television. See It Now was to television what Gone with the Wind was to the movies. It was its big moment.
We'll be ready to go whenever you are, Mr. Murrow.
For Murrow, the genius of television wasn't the gadgetry, but the fact that it could bring the world into people's homes.
Howard K. Smith, reporting from the Chaillot Palace in Paris. Hello, Edward R. Murrow.
Gastonia has a white high school and one for Negroes. This one is for whites.
I'm against the Negroes and the whites going to school together. I think that we as white people have developed an air of superiority over their race.
Murrow tackled segregation at home and apartheid abroad.
The Union of South Africa has been called a melting pot of the races, in which nothing melts, not even the human heart.
I think he was a little bit of an evangelist, that he wanted to change the world for the better.
This minority group is their own permanent majority. They call themselves Afrikaners.
Television news could easily have become, in its earliest days, a kind of supermarket tabloid version of the news on the air, and it didn't because of the standard Murrow set.
We are 10 years late with this story, but this week our cameras were permitted to visit what might be called the birthplace of the atomic age. We entered by way of the same elevator that used to carry the uranium and graphite down to the first pile. We asked all of the original team that could be assembled to stand where they stood 10 years ago.
It was inventive. It was unusual. When I would walk home the night of the show and the windows were open, the weather was good, I would hear our theme music coming out of every window in New York. We were the most exciting thing that ever happened to television. People's eyes opened. Their minds started to think.
See It Now's intimate portrayals of frightened, homesick soldiers celebrating Christmas in Korea provided an emotional bond between the nation and its fighting men.
This is Korea, where a war is going on. That's a Marine digging a hole in the ground. They dig an awful lot of holes in the ground in Korea.
Stand by!
Christmas in Korea was not about the latest battles, body counts, or bombing missions. It was the soldier's story and the people's story.
Harry, what do you think about this Korean War situation?
Well, sir, I think we are fighting for a good cause.
Second platoon, Fox Company, begins to move out. This is a quiet sector of the line. Probably no real opposition, but a guy could get killed.
Corporal John J. York, Nashville, Tennessee. PFC Edward R. Gaines, Memphis, Tennessee. PFC Roberto Cortina from Brunswick, Texas.
Private Jeff Davis, Alabama. Sergeant so-and-so, Massachusetts. So-and-so, Washington. So-and-so.
it had an incredible quality of bringing home to you the fact that these were soldiers, American soldiers, in Korea fighting a war, and here's where they came from, and they were the 48 states. So it had an enormous effect of bringing this to you.
Private Stanford Murphy, Quincy, Massachusetts. Private Albert Fields, Brooklyn, New York.
It wasn't that we saw blood and gore, but we saw human beings fighting a war. And to that extent, all of this kind of thing was brand new.
It looked rather peaceful, didn't it? Permit me to inform you that since those pictures were taken, Fox Company took all of its objectives south of Kumsan. It took 50 casualties. Lieutenant Fred Walters, the company CEO, who is still a lieutenant, took a machine gun bullet in the chest. But he's recovering and doing nicely. The outfit is still in the line. They may need some blood. Could you spare a pint?
This is Morley Safer reporting in Warsaw.
This is Douglas LaChance in Bonn.
Michael McClure reporting from the Belgian Congo.
The CBC transformed itself into a world-class news organization when it hired top reporters and sent them off to cover breaking stories.
This is Don Gordon reporting in Johannesburg.
We needed a Canadian eye on things because we couldn't always rely on the American version or the British version or the Russians or whatever. And time again, the question was, well, what's really going on?
Dr. Castro, apart from your land reform, do you plan to take over any of the foreign companies here?
No, we have not spoken about that.
Canadians were watching their reporters talking to the world leaders face to face.
And like in Canada, we find support too in the public opinion.
What arose out of it was that the viewing public were able to get a moral and emotional context that simply didn't exist before, and by which they could judge national policies.
That was a big one. It came in right close here among the troops standing here.
Your picture may provide the piece of
CBC reporters found themselves in riots, revolutions, and civil wars. Canadians no longer had to watch American newscasts. Now, Canadian reporters were unearthing front-page stories before their American colleagues.
This is the last gasp of Tunisia's battle of Frenchmen versus Tunisians.
We tried to beat them, and we did remarkably well considering the relative size of the operation. So we tried to give a reputation. Canadian news people are the first ones there. Canadian news people are the ones that ferret out or smell out a story before it really breaks.
Crush out the divine spark of religion, and you have the dark, godless society of communism.
The early 50s was a disturbing period in the United States. The country was swept up in an anti-communist witch hunt, and the entertainment industry was targeted as a haven for communist sympathizers. An organization known as Red Channels published a pamphlet that identified people suspected of being communists.
There was a real danger at that time. The Red Channels people were busily at work. They could condemn you and get you off the air in a minute. One phone call. The network management was so chicken in those days, it was frightening.
A good friend of mine, who was the vice president for programs of the radio network, suddenly disappeared one night. He just left. The next morning found a note on my desk saying, sorry, I couldn't say goodbye, but I've cleared out all my books and papers and I'm gone. I probably will never see you again. Well, you know, you make the assumption that there was something in his background and somebody got after him and he left.
Do solemnly swear or affirm.
Government workers had to swear publicly that they were not communists. So the networks demanded that all their employees also sign a loyalty oath.
Organization now.
Well, I was a loyal American citizen. I'd served in the Navy during the Second World War, so it was hardly a shame to sign a loyalty oath. It just seemed to belabor the obvious that why do you have to sign a loyalty oath to your own country? That doesn't sound American. But a lot of us did it because we wanted to keep our jobs.
In spite of his own misgivings, Murrow asked the staff of See It Now to sign these loyalty oaths to save their jobs and to protect the show. Howard K. Smith, who was listed in red channels, believes Murrow's compromise may have saved his career.
There it was in black and white. My name was listed. I sat there and waited for something terrible to happen, because to most people to whom that happened, their careers were destroyed. Nothing happened. And late in life, I discovered that it was Murrow. People knew that to get to me, to attack me, to destroy me, they'd have to go past Murrow, and they didn't want to take him on. So I think I was saved by that.
The raw, harsh, unpleasant fact is that communism is an issue and will be an issue in 1954.
Under the banner of anti-communism, Senator Joe McCarthy destroyed the lives and ruined the reputations of government officials and Army officers. But journalists and politicians were terrified to attack McCarthy. They were fearful that McCarthy, in turn, would destroy their careers.
McCarthy was a fascist, and of the worst type. There was nothing American about the man, except having been born in Wisconsin. He was a demagogue of absolutely the worst type.
Any man who has been given the honor of being promoted to general and who says, I will protect another general who protects communists is not fit to wear that uniform, General.
You were lying. We both agreed on that.
I was terribly concerned and alarmed. I saw the first stages of a fascist revolution in this country.
Good evening. Tonight, See It Now devotes its entire half hour to a report on Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, told mainly in his own words and pictures. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty.
This time, Murrow refused to compromise and launched a daring attack on the powerful senator.
We were called in, the whole staff in the cutting room was called in, and Murrow said, you cannot live in a democracy, you cannot live in this country without doing something that maybe you will be suspect by this McCarthy. You will now be visible because your credit will be on the air, your names will be publicized. If there is anything in your background that you don't want to reveal, or if you have fear, don't work on the program. And Murrow ordered that wherever McCarthy is, we should shoot film. And the film kept coming in, and we saved film for about a year.
You wrote a book in 32, is that correct?
Yes,
I wrote a book. This is the document.
Murrow demonstrated how McCarthy would take quotations out of context and distort their meaning.
Stevenson to the Mont Tremblant Conference.
But Senator McCarthy didn't permit his audience to hear the entire paragraph. This is the official...
Murrow was also not afraid to express his own personal opinion.
The line between investigating and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly.
See It Now was the only public forum that ever attacked McCarthy on the airwaves. On the airwaves. And it took a great deal of bravery. It took a great deal of guts.
And whose fault is that? Not really his. He didn't create this situation of fear. He merely exploited it, and rather successfully. Cassius was right. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. Good night, and good luck.
See It Now was the first of the influential broadcasts in television that changed America. The Murrow-McCarthy broadcast ended Joe McCarthy. It was an arrow right through wham.
When television first covered political conventions, the hidden world of politics was suddenly transformed into a national spectacle. It was theater and history, unfolding before the viewer's eyes.
It was drama all the way. You saw those platform fights, and you saw the dealing and the wheeling for delegates right in front of you live.
At the Republican Convention of 1952, Dwight Eisenhower ran the first made-for-TV campaign, with stars like Clark Gable in the spotlight.
Man who has written a song that all America loves to sing.
Eisenhower's supporters were enthusiastic and dynamic. His opponent, Robert Taft, an old-school politician, was convinced he could win by the old rules of backroom maneuverings.
The Taft people who controlled both the Credentials Committee and the National Committee itself decided to keep television away. They allowed reporters in, but not television cameras. And so television kept showing a picture of a closed door, and the symbol of the closed door became unbearable.
Senator Robert Taft made the fatal error of trying to seize control of the convention with the cameras rolling.
A steal was taking place, even if they didn't call it that. The public recognized, and the politicians recognized, and they also recognized that they couldn't go along anymore with closed door, back room, smoky room, getting the presidential nomination set in order so they could take it to the delegates. The whole public became aware of it.
The party organizers and backroom boys were being pushed aside by the television advisors.
I guess maybe it was there in '52 that you had to understand that a politician had to take command of the screen if he's going to get elected president, if he's going to persuade the country.
At the convention, Richard Nixon was Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate. He would use television to save his career. There were a number of newspaper stories that suggested that Nixon was involved in a scandal of receiving gifts from unnamed financial backers. There was talk that he would be dropped from the ticket.
My fellow Americans, I come before you tonight as a candidate for the vice presidency.
Nixon believed that the only way to put the scandal to rest was to talk directly to the American people in a television and radio address. Go right over the heads of the newspaper reporters.
We did get something, a gift, after the election. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted.
Nixon portrayed himself as the decent citizen who was standing up to his faceless enemies.
And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checker. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
It was terribly corny, but it worked. It was mawkish, but he pulled all the stops out. It was a very clever performance. Television saved him. Had it not been for that checkered speech, I think he would have gone down the drain. We might never have heard from Nixon again.
Television was more effective as an image-making tool than as an instrument to reform politics.
We dreamed, for example, that only the best candidates would rise to the surface because the public would be able to see through the charlatans, and they'd be able to expose the candidate for, warts and everything. We dreamed that sloganeering and any kind of falsity in advertising would be eliminated, but it didn't come off that way.
Mr. Samara, that you just talk to the people, don't refer to any particular issues. Do you feel that this is an accurate impression on our part? Or
well, I don't refer to any particular issues because
in Canada, the affable Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent and the Liberal Party would learn too late that television would shake up the political landscape. The Liberals had been in power for 2 decades. The power behind the throne, an old-style politician, C.D. Howe.
He hated the camera, hated to go on it. He came across as a cranky old man who didn't want to be talking to anybody.
It has long been the federal responsibility to control the export of energy.
Howe suffered through a television interview.
It was the style of a chief executive officer. He doesn't have time, and let alone any interest, in talking to millions of people out there. He's running the business.
There would be one politician who would embrace television. Conservative leader John Diefenbaker, and he would enchant a nation.
This is a time for greatness in Canada. The raising of a vision, catching something of the greatness of our past. For a nation without a past has little hope for a future.
He was a spellbinder, and it was only through the power of television that you could see and be caught up in the dream, too. He conjured up a dream.
But his advisors were amazed how television could turn Diefenbaker's trademark whistle stops into a national myth.
You could go to some place, a population of 200, stop the train, you could speak to 200 people. But it was such great television. It was very powerful stuff. You know, we hadn't really any idea of the power that this meeting would have and how it would destroy politics as we knew it.
As for C.D. Howe, television destroyed his political career.
Douglas Fisher is the CCF member for Port Arthur.
Douglas Fisher beat C.D. Howe's impressive political machine by weaving his way through the local television station.
I knew the people who worked there, including the chief technician, whose kids I taught at school. And so he said, you know, you could put on programs here. And so I went and inquired, and I bought up time. And I became the television personality of the region in the 6 weeks before the election. And by the time Howe's people woke up to it, that I was the fair-haired boy, it was too late.
Although this is largely a technical budget, some Canadians will benefit immediately.
As television began to dominate politics, television reporters began to wield authority, and nobody was as influential as television's first parliamentary correspondent, Norman DePoe.
Dixon, you described this as a do-nothing budget, and you used the expression cold porridge.
He smelled of the news. He was convincing. He was authentic.
Party leaders elected, Mr. Diefenbaker, Mr. Pearson. The end of 2 days of intense political activity. This is Norman DePoe on the floor.
He really put the imprimatur on CBC News and made it, I suppose you'd have to say, made it dependable.
Diefenbaker's executive assistant, Gowan, I guess, said to me, if we only had control of Norman DePoe, we would be elected forever. He had that much impact. People, when he said something, people believed it.
Mr. DePoe, last evening I listened to him, endeavoring to build up a defense on behalf of the government's attitude, which was historically wrong.
It was alleged that Deef once said the most important person in his scrum that he was talking to was Norman DePoe in the CBC television news. In other words, a group of 60 reporters gathered around the Prime Minister, or 50 or 40. The person the Prime Minister was focusing on mentally was Norman DePoe.
Every other person last night on CBC was objective. But you conjured up.
Sir, you are making this statement outside the chamber. Do you make it on your...
I'm making it here. Have you got anything to say about it?
Yes, sir. I deny utterly that I attempted to defend this government.
Just another example of what you've done so frequently of endeavoring to exculpate the government regardless of any consequence.
Voici René Lévesque.
Bonsoir. Et aussitôt dit que fait, parce que tout de suite, si vous voulez, dès cette première émission, eh bien, on va sauter.
Another journalist was becoming a folk hero. René Lévesque explained the complexities of foreign affairs to his Quebec audience.
The public felt intelligent listening to René Lévesque, being able to understand every term he was using, because he was using very simple terms, very day-to-day terms to explain the most complicated situations.
L'Algérie, qui il y a quelques semaines seulement, a franchi la Méditerranée et a débarqué, pour ainsi dire, dans la vieille France métropolitaine.
His counterparts in English Canada were in awe of his command of the medium.
Bravura presentation, just brilliant. And in comparison, ours was labored, stodgy, artificial, scripted. Oh, yeah, no, it's just a revelation to me.
He'd have no script that I knew of. He'd probably written something. But just talk and walk around smoking.
pour l'instant, sont dirigés surtout sur les agents de police.
Television was made for people like René Lévesque. And I do think that his television personality is the making of The Politician, or The Politician, was made by the TV. I have no idea. But, you know, without that, he would have been probably a rabble-rousing professor.
In 1959, René Lévesque was out on strike with the other Radio-Canada employees. But there was no support in the rest of the CBC. Lévesque felt an intense feeling of betrayal.
And suddenly, Lévesque got up and exploded into major accusations against the federal government, saying, of course, it's because it's the French network. If it were the English network in Toronto, they would move their asses.
He said, this is the reward of living under the great, bright Canadian sun.
And it was the first such explosion in the national direction from René Lévesque. And I knew very well it was the first one because I had worked with him for a long time.
From that point of view, the way was not long to travel to become a fervent, at least autonomist, and later on an independentist.
It was during the bitter struggle to desegregate schools that cameras witnessed a nation torn apart by racial intolerance in Alabama, Louisiana, and Little Rock, Arkansas. In Little Rock, the governor of Arkansas refused to protect black students who were trying to enter an all-white school. President Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne to escort the children.
One of the differences we can report this morning is that when I first went to Little Rock, about a little more than 50% of American homes had television sets. Those people had never seen a constitutional crisis play out in their living rooms. It was a classic civics lesson more than anything else. It was the one that had the most lasting effect because it taught people about their country and about their government and about power.
Are you going to go to school here at Central High?
The reporters found it difficult to be impartial.
I went to Little Rock, for example, with the intention of stressing objectivity. I want to be fair to both sides. But it doesn't last long because the anti-civil rights forces were absolutely wrong. The Constitution was being violated by them every day. And our traditions were being violated. And they simply had no standing. If you were going to be a fair reporter, you had to say this side is wrong. The southern side.
The people who were most shocked were the people who lived in Little Rock, because suddenly a national mirror had been shown up against them, and they were seeing themselves on the tube every morning on the Today Show and every night on Nightly News or the other evening news programs, and they hated it. They are in the school now. The
television reporters themselves became targets.
On the steps up there,
their faces were seen every day on the television screens.
Walked in. A car would come and just follow me along the curb, just slowly, with 4 men in it or 6 men in it, not saying anything and not doing anything, and scaring the pants off me because I didn't know when they might burst out or the shotgun might go off or anything. There was one of the most effective uses of terror that I've ever seen, and it lasted for about 6 blocks. And I wouldn't run because I wouldn't give them that. So I wet my pants instead. We understood that the movement for civil rights in the United States was being amplified and accelerated, and that we were part of it. Those of us in television were helping that amplification and acceleration. We knew that social change had taken a turn to porn states. We knew that race relations would never be the same.
Alcoa, Aluminum Company of America. By the end of the decade, Edward R. Murrow learned the cruel lesson of television. You need a sponsor to survive. And sponsors preferred shows that made the audience feel good to shows that stirred up controversy.
The sponsors were terrified. And suddenly they said, well, you have made our reputation sweet. Everybody knows we're the good guys now because we did See It Now. And now we're going to do drama shows because we think it's better for our image. And Murrow could not get another sponsor. Could not. And so that was the beginning of the end of See It Now.
Edward R. Murrow's old friend and boss, Bill Paley, now thought Murrow was more trouble than he was worth. He told Murrow that See It Now gave him stomach aches.
Bill Paley, who was a very civilized man and who early on had been a great supporter and sponsor of Murrow's, was a businessman. And his idea of being successful in business was to make more money each successive year. And that had to apply to television as well.
With popular shows filling his schedule, Bill Paley no longer needed the prestige that Murrow had conferred on CBS. The Murrow era was over. Bill Paley was still committed to CBS News as the jewel in his crown, but Edward R. Murrow's role would be diminished.
His problem with Murrow was almost like a problem about religion and about power. Who really ran CBS? And in a sense, Murrow felt that he did, because he had brought such incredible legitimacy to the organization. But Paley knew, and Murrow should have known, that he did. Paley ran it. It was his candy store.
Murrow left CBS to join the Kennedy administration. He was disheartened and cynical about the business he left behind.
Our history will be what we make it. And if there are any historians about 50 or 100 years from now, and there should be preserved the kinescopes for 1 week of all 3 networks, they will there find recorded in black and white or perhaps in color evidence of decadence, escapism, and insulation from the realities of the world in which we live. Just once in a while, let us exalt the importance of ideas and information. Would this somehow blemish the corporate image? Would the stockholders rise up and object? I think not.
Edward R. Murrow never returned to broadcasting. He died in 1965.